everyone, welcome back to the Tox Lab. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Rob. This week we're looking at a rather different sphere of science, Broscience. We're going to be looking at some of the compounds found traded in locker rooms and on bodybuilding forums and try and drill into some of the risks and toxicity that come with those compounds. A few weeks ago we had a request and we were asked if we could look at performance-enhancing drugs. Performance-enhancing drugs is an absolutely massive area. There are toxicologists who dedicate their entire career to detecting drugs in Olympians and things like that. We thought we'd narrow it down and have a look at one or two compounds in particular to try and focus it in a bit. And we're going to be looking at some compounds called SARMs. You ever come across SARMs, Rebecca?
I have had them pop up in a case recently, but before that I'd never heard of them.
So what are SARMs? Well, SARMs are selective androgen receptor modulators. They're drugs that are designed to act a bit like anabolic steroids. And really, the pitch is that you can get all of the muscle building and the power without the hair loss and the mood swings or various parts of your anatomy shrinking. At least that's the premise. They were originally developed as medications. The plan was to try and treat things like osteoporosis, muscle wasting conditions, but they never got FDA approval. And now they're sold as workout supplements, as research chemicals, sometimes under catchy titles like hard bulk and alpha mass. And how do they work? Well, they bind to androgen receptors in the same way that testosterone does. But in theory, they're selective. They only activate muscles and bone and shouldn't activate the prostate and things like that, in theory. So today we're going to dive into what happens when SARM use goes rogue and enters the Broscience sphere. We're going to look at some mislabeled products and also some case reports as well. So Rebecca, why don't you dive into our first paper?
So the first paper we're going to look at today involves illegal products containing SARMs in Italy. So the aim of the study was to purchase products on the internet in 2022 that were being targeted to consumers based in Italy and seeing what they contained. So they selected 2 different websites for purchases and purchased 13 food supplement products in total, and these all claimed to contain SARMs. And to identify what was present, they were using LCMS to identify them and then NMR for quantitation to work out how much of each SARM was present in each product. So when looking at all the different retail websites, 7 out of 9 of the websites they looked at stated that these products were for research use only and therefore not fit for human consumption. But they all reported information on dosages and phases of the bodybuilding plan and when you should be taking them. Some websites even linked to quite reputable sources like PubMed and the NIH website and links to papers talking about SARMs and their effectiveness. As part of the study, they also looked at social media and how SARMs are being talked about over there. And there seemed to be 3 main aspects, 3 main themes that they saw. So there was the obvious exchange of information among users, talking about means of administration and stacking with other substances. And it was often bros giving advice to beginners. Obviously, a lot of these products were also being sold in plain sight on social media platforms and private channels, including Telegram. And from comments on Reddit and things like that, it seems the research only tag doesn't hamper sales. And people are still willing to go out and buy these and give them a go. And looking at the Google trends in SARMs in Italy from 2013 to 2023, there was a growth in searches on Google from 2018 peaking at about 2021. So onto the 13 products that they'd purchased. They visually inspected each one. Most of them contained research only on the label, but then also had dosage information, which is quite counterintuitive. When looking at the SARMs that were present in each product, the stated SARM was present in approximately 70% of samples, and this included Osterin, Ligandrol, Cardarin was also present, but this isn't a true SARM, this is a PPAR agonist, and we'll come on to that a bit later. 23% of the products had a different SARM present, and 30% of them had an undeclared pharmaceutical substance detected, and this ranged from selective estrogen receptor modulators like tamoxifen Testosterone was present in one of them, along with tadalafil, and epimethandione was present in 3 samples.
So quite a range of different compounds that weren't SARMs found in there, including some anabolic steroids. And clearly, if your logic is, I'm going to buy SARMs because they don't have the risks of steroids, to then find you're purchasing steroids clearly is going to be a problem. Tadalafil, that's a PDE5 inhibitor, similar to Viagra, right?
Yeah.
I know we probably shouldn't laugh. The idea of a product being a sort of testosterone booster or a steroid, and actually it simply makes it feel like it's increasing your testosterone by dilating certain blood vessels, I do find quite amusing.
So when looking at the quantity of SARMs in each of the products, 4 of the samples contained 80 to 95% of their declared content, 3 samples contained 60 to 80%, and 1 was highly underdosed.
So they had dosing instructions on the back, but actually contained much less than they said they were going to have.
And also, when looking at these products that they'd purchased, they contain lots of other ingredients alongside the SARMs that do have potential to cause harm depending on their purity or their grade. So some of these did contain rice flour, and if that's not properly prepared, you risk having heavy metals like cadmium and arsenic in there. And a lot of these capsules were like gelatin-based capsules. And again, if this isn't a sufficient grade, there's risk of transmitting like prion diseases and things like that. And a lot of these were also coloured pills or capsules, but there was no mentioning of any sort of colourants on the label, and these weren't disclosed, so that is a potential cause for concern.
So a lot of excipients simply weren't stated on the label.
Yep.
It's quite concerning, isn't it? A lot of the marketing, I mean, it's hard to express the marketing on a podcast, but to describe it, we are looking at very, very eye-catching marketing designs, aren't we? You know, alpha bulk with a man covered in muscles, skulls, all sorts of, help me with a better word, Rebecca, masculine kind of marketing.
Yeah. It's designed to draw you in and make promises about what it will do to your like muscle gains and things like that.
So what's worse, no ingredients or all of the ingredients?
Ooh.
They carry with them 2 different risks, don't they? Clearly taking products that contain lots of things that aren't in there is a problem. Probably somebody buying something that contained no active ingredient is a different kind of problem.
And especially with those products that contained SARMs and multiple other like pharmaceutically active ingredients, we don't know how they all sort of interact and play together, and there could be significant risks associated with consuming all of those at once.
Okay, so why don't we now move on to the next paper, a study looking at the safety of these compounds?
Yep. So this next paper is a systemic review of SARMs and their safety. So this group basically searched for case reports and clinical studies reporting on the safety data. This group looked at case reports and clinical studies where safety data of SARMs have been reported in healthy individuals. So jumping into the clinical studies, they managed to find 18 and 17 of which were clinical trials. And across these, 13 unique SARMs were tested. 2,136 patients were involved in total, with 1,447 patients being exposed. And across these different clinical trials, the median age was 57 years and the median weight was 81.2 kilograms. 9 of these studies only involved men, 4 only involved females, and the remainder were mixed populations. And some serious adverse effects were reported in 6 of the clinical trials, including chest pain, maculopapular rash with a raised ALT, which is indicative of a drug reaction. There were 2 cases of rhabdomyolysis, although these weren't considered drug-related, so I'm not sure how they made that determination. And other effects such as an acute MI, cancers, pulmonary embolism were also all reported.
So one of the things the big study looking at safety data did was it compared a lot of clinical trials, didn't it? So, as I said at the start, these compounds were originally developed and tested as pharmaceuticals. And so there were clinical trials using these drugs in various different illnesses. A lot of the dosages used in those clinical trials, let's look particularly at Osterin, because that's easily comparable and is one of the more common SARMs, was between 1 to 3 milligrams a day, when we looked at that Italian paper, some of the forum dosage recommendations were between 10 and 30 milligrams a day. So not only are there a range of adverse effects in the use of SARMs at dosages 1 to 3 milligrams, actually the black market use of SARMs is actually suggesting doses 10 times that.
So 10 of these clinical trials reported raised liver enzymes as a complication of their use. And these ranged between 1 to 2 times the upper limit of normal and varied with each trial and with each different SARM that was being tested. A couple of the studies also saw decreases in HDL and decrease in total testosterone and SHBG.
And these are the effects that the marketing says SARMs don't cause, right?
So it's quite interesting. And some of these also showed an increase in haemoglobin and raised blood pressure, which could potentially contribute to sort of cardiovascular disease risk. Some of the individuals in these clinical trials were reporting acute MIs and coronary symptoms. So
an increased cardiac risk is one of the things we see with more traditional anabolic steroid use.
And a lot of the common symptoms seen in the clinical trial data were headaches, dry mouth, constipation, dyspepsia, nausea, and upper respiratory infections.
That's interesting. I wonder why that is.
I'm not too sure. So moving on to the case reports they looked at, they identified 15 manuscripts with a total of 18 different cases. 88% of these case reports reported drug-induced liver injury following SARM use, all of which involved men with a mean age of 35 years, who were reportedly using SARMs for muscle building and were described as being athletic or bodybuilders, and 2 were on active military duty. The majority of these cases involved the use of a single SARM, most commonly LGD 4033, which were found in 8 of these cases, RAD 140 in 6 of them, and endosarm, which is Ostrin, which was found in 3 cases. And these were commonly being taken daily. The mean duration of SARM consumption before symptoms presented was approximately 6.7 weeks, and where reported, the mean time from discontinuation of the SARM to symptoms presenting was about 14 days. And the majority of patients presenting with a drug-induced liver injury presented with a raised bilirubin and a hepatocellular pattern of liver injury, so raised ALT and AST. And this was initially their picture, but then they developed cholestasis and they had a subsequent rise in their ALP. A couple of these individual cases had quite interesting presentations. So a 36-year-old male who was a competitive powerlifter ruptured his Achilles tendon while playing dodgeball, and that was attributed to his SARM use. Another one of these cases was reported in the systemic review I managed to actually find the paper for. And so this case involved a 43-year-old male who was a sports coach presenting to his emergency department with epigastric pain, myalgia, severe headache, and brown urine. He had cycled approximately 120 kilometres the day before he presented to the emergency department, and they found that he'd taken Ostrin a day before at a dose of 20 milligrams, and Cardarin, which is a peroxisome proliferator activated receptor delta agonist, which is a mouthful, in the 4 days in the lead up to this at a dose of 20 milligrams per day.
So Cardarin isn't a SARM. As Rebecca says, it's got that really long-winded name that I'm not going to try and repeat.
Peroxisome proliferator activated receptor delta agonist.
That's the one. And it activates a pathway that leads to fat loss. So the theory with Cardarin is that it increases fat burning and helps you reduce your body fat. This, like SARMs, was originally trialled as a medication and never made it through clinical trials. Rat data saw an increase in GI tumours, I think, and so it never made it through clinical trials for human use.
So he'd bought both of these on the internet and was taking them approximately 10 days before he presented. On admission, his BP was 135/70 with a heart rate of 76 BPM. ECG was normal, but his abdomen was quite painful. He had raised liver enzymes, both ALT and AST, but a normal bilirubin. His CK, creatine kinase, was raised, and this increased several hours later, which was a sign of his rhabdomyolysis worsening, so his muscles were breaking down. And he was treated with IV hydration. He experienced continuing muscle pain and had weakness for about 15 days, but his labs were normal after about 2 weeks, and he'd completely recovered 6 weeks after the event. And during his stay, blood, urine and hair samples were taken for toxicology, and the white powders was also sent for testing.
So this is quite a complicated case, isn't it? He had quite an extreme exercise history. Whilst clearly people do extreme cycling like that fairly often, also people developing rhabdo and things like that after extreme exercise is a thing, even in the absence of SARMs. In this case, he also had a liver injury.
Yes, yeah.
So that's perhaps less likely, although I guess rhabdo could potentially have contributed to some of that as well. Yeah, it's an interesting case, isn't it?
So the powders were sent for testing to determine what was present and how pure the substances were. So they tested positive for ostrin and cardrin. The purity of the ostrin was 28%, but the cardrin was 100% pure, which I thought was quite impressive for stuff put online that they hadn't put other things in. And this is obviously an estimate based on, I think they were using peak area to estimate how pure these were, so it's not an exact science. So both ostrin and cardrin were found in both blood and hair. So ostrin was found in the blood at a concentration of 1 nanogram per mil, and cardrin was found at a concentration of 403 nanograms per mil. In hair, ostrin was found at a concentration of 1,105 picograms per milligram, and cardrin was found at 146 picograms per milligram. And interestingly, ostrin was only present in the urine at a concentration of 88 nanograms per mil. They didn't see any cardrin. Cardrin is extensively metabolized and is only present for approximately 5 days, and the sample was sent 10 days after he'd claimed to have finished taking them, so it's not surprising they weren't seen. But I do believe they saw metabolites including cardrin sulfoxide and cardrin sulfone. So when looking at hair analysis, often they'll do segmented analysis to kind of work out long-term use and whether usage has changed over time. Based on the hair collected, they weren't able to perform segmental analysis, but comparing the levels seen to cases of like doping challenges and drug trafficking, the measured concentration of ostrin was much higher in this case than would suggest infrequent use. So it seems like he'd been taking it a lot longer than he said he'd been taking it for.
And potentially at higher doses as well.
Yeah.
So I think lots to take in there, right? There's this big market, potentially growing market of supplements claiming to provide you with muscle gains without some of the negative side effects. And yet there's also a body of evidence that says these compounds actually do carry with them quite a lot of adverse effects, even at doses much lower than that which is being used by individuals seeking muscle gaining benefits. It's really, really tricky, isn't it? I think this isn't an endorsement, but if your sole aim is to gain muscle fast, anabolic steroids just do incredible things in terms of their physiological effect, yet clearly carry with them a lot of negative side effects, a lot of downsides. And I can see why people might want to try an alternative that claims to have all of these perceived benefits, but none of the risks.
What I found quite interesting with the SARMs is that although they contain dosage information, they're all sort of advertised as like research-only chemicals. And to me, that would put me off from taking something, but it doesn't seem to be deterring anyone from trying them out.
I think the research label really is a sort of marketing. It gets around certain medicines laws and things like that. I mean, it is a completely unregulated market. The fact that these compounds are sold online quite freely, and I'm sure also in person in gym locker rooms and things like that. Unlike the drug world, where there is an effort, I think, to try and control a lot of these substances, actually, there doesn't seem to be too much control of SARMs outside of anti-doping within competitive sport, which is clearly we haven't really mentioned that, but these compounds are all banned by the World Anti-Doping Association.
Yeah, I think they were banned in 2008.
Completely reasonably. But within the uncompetitive market, this is completely unregulated. Anabolic steroids are controlled under the Misuse of Drugs Act. I don't think SARMs are currently. I could be wrong. So do you think people that use these compounds are necessarily aware of the risks?
No, I think it's one of those that people aren't necessarily going to talk about the negatives behind SARM use. And I feel like unless it's happened to someone you know, you're not going to necessarily know that there are quite significant risks associated with their use. But it's definitely something people need to be aware of if they are going to go down that route and take them.
Yeah, for sure. It is a really tricky world because, behind a lot of this, sometimes there's quite a lot of like body dysmorphia and, underlying psychological things going on as well.
But yeah, it's like with anything, when there's a perceived quick fix, that's always going to come with some risk. And it's just important to keep in the back of your mind if someone's promising you something that's going to help you build muscle really quickly, what negatives come with that.
Yeah, for sure. They certainly don't appear to be, based on that safety data, the safe alternative to steroids. Possibly safer, maybe.
Yeah.
But certainly not safe. One of the other possible complications here, of course, is that people don't always use just one substance, do they? Often if they're going down a route of chemical-assisted bodybuilding, they may use other compounds to help, as we saw with the case, Cardarin to help with fat loss. You might see people using clenbuterol or stimulants and things like that to also bring up metabolism. Previously, we've talked about 2,4-DMP on this podcast, haven't we, which is a very different compound, but also can be used in that sphere. There's probably quite a lot of poly use as well.
Yeah, and I'm definitely aware of, for example, Ostrin and Cardarin being sold in a mix together to kind of promote muscle gain and fat loss in one stack.
They call it in the gym sphere, I'm told. So should we be worried? Just thinking in terms of the rise in kind of social media influencers and gym influencers and young people wanting to aspire to a particular phenotype.
Yeah, I guess with them being advertised so widely and freely on social media, you are going to get that younger generation wanting to try it and not considering the risks associated. And it's something that does need to be considered. Okay,
so in summary then, there's an awful lot of products out there claiming to be safe alternative to steroids. There's a huge amount of variation in what's actually in them versus what's actually listed on the side. There's a huge amount of online dosage data, which is much higher than that, which was used in clinical trial data. And clinical trials were stopped because of the adverse effects. So I think it's really hard to conclude that SARMs are a safe alternative to steroids. And clearly they carry with them a lot of risks. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. I hope you've enjoyed listening this week. Do give us a like, give us a follow, share with your friends.
You can find us on Instagram at _tox_lab. We also have a LinkedIn page called the Tox Lab where we post about each new episode. So feel free to comment over there. Any feedback on any of our episodes, any suggestions for future ones, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to send us a DM. For those of you who don't use social media, we also have an email. So you can email us at thetoxlab@gmail.com. And we'd love to hear from you over there as well. All of the papers we talked about will be linked in the description of the episode below, so feel free to check them out if you want to have a read into any of these topics a little bit more. Hope you all have an amazing week, and we'll see you next time. Bye!